So I want to take a moment and just introduce our two undergraduate researchers who are going to be making a presentation to you today. First we have Shadi Mousavi, maybe if you wave. Shadi is a senior here at Rutgers. She's graduating this spring. She's a political science major. She's worked with me all year. She did research in the fall regarding young elected leaders and has worked on this Are You Voting project all year and has hopes of going to law school in the future. Zain Haq is class of 2014 from the School of Arts and Sciences, the honors program, political science and philosophy major. He's an Arresti research associate and will be working on Are You Voting, our outreach efforts next fall. And I want to take a moment and really compliment them and congratulate them on the work they've done this year. They've done a great deal of work since even before September. And that work has included conducting a lit review, getting IRB certified, recruiting subjects, which is not always very fun to do, to go stand out on a street corner and ask people to be a research subject, to learn how to use SPSS, to actually code qualitative data, and do some data analysis with quantitative data. And especially in the last 3 or 4 weeks, we've worked pretty hard, including a session here yesterday, getting ready. And when you work this closely with students over a long period of time, you get to know them well. So for example, Shadi and I have learned that we have a shared interest in both anything French and vegetarianism. And I learned fairly recently that Zain is a pilot, which I found incredible, and even flew himself to his spring break destination. So if anyone ever needs a quick getaway and need a pilot, talk to one of his many skills. Okay, so the format for today is Shadi is going to begin with a brief lit review and really identify what our research questions were and outline what our research design was. Then Zain is going to talk about the qualitative component of our research project, focus groups that were conducted in the fall, and give you an idea of our findings this year and how they compare to our findings from last year. He's going to hand it back to Shadi, and she's going to let you know about some quantitative data analysis they did with an existing data set of using a national sample of young people. We'll hand it back to Zain for conclusions and implications of what their findings were. And then we'll open it up to question and answer. Okay? So thank you all for coming, and I will be the clicker. Shadi.
Okay, so just gonna get right to it. So our research subjects are the millennial generation, today's young people. And what we're interested in studying is youth engagement in their communities and beyond. The reason that we are interested in young people is because they are, or the millennial generation, is because they are unprecedented in their size and their scope and their diversity. They're the most highly educated, the most in debt, and the most socially connected. So they could have, if they are politically engaged, wonderful effects for the future of democracy. But if they are disengaged, then the effects for the future of democracy can be very, very detrimental. So we're going to be using the word engagement a lot today. So I just want to take the time now to talk about what we mean when we use the word engagement, because we're following a very specific typology that's also used in the literature that informs our research. So there are 4 kinds of engagement. The first kind is cognitive, and I think of this as the most kind of minimal kind of engagement. It's simply just being aware of what's going on. So it could be watching TV, reading the newspaper, or even just discussing politics or events. The next kind of engagement is political engagement, and this is just a very traditional kind of way of being engaged. It's voting, and it's really what it is. It's activities that are undertaken to affect the makeup of government. So it could also be, working on a campaign. Then there's expressive engagement, and this is affecting the actions of government. So this can be boycotting, protesting. And then finally, there's civic engagement, and this is being involved in improving the community you're in. So it could be volunteering, community service. So those are our 4 kinds. And in our research, we really want to better understand the nature of this typology. Specifically, we want to understand what millennial attitudes are towards civic and political participation. And we want to know how these attitudes connect to their behavior. And we did this in 2 ways. We had a qualitative approach using focus groups. And we also explored quantitative data being an existing national data set. So what do we know? The origins of this subject and just engagement in general really, for us, start with Robert Putnam's well-known book, Bowling Alone. I don't know if you guys heard of it. But when he talks about young people, he says, it is as though the post-war generations were exposed to some anti-civic X-ray that permanently and increasingly rendered them less likely to connect with the community. So following that, some people contested this view, and one in particular is Cliff Zukin. Cliff Zukin argues that it's not that young people are totally apathetic and totally disengaged, they just they engage differently. And he suggests that maybe young people just don't favor the traditional forms of political engagement. Maybe they are more into civic engagement, volunteering, community service kind of stuff. And this is really where our research takes off. We really want to explore what we feel this is a very unanswered question, it's an open-ended question, and we want to know, we want to know more about the schism that seems to maybe be there between political and civic engagement. We want to know, have you substituted traditional forms of political engagement for community involvement and civic engagement? And so in the most recent Harvard IOP poll this past fall, they asked, which do you think is a better way to solve important issues facing the country, through political engagement or through community volunteerism? And you can see that 33% said community volunteerism, and 21% said political engagement. So that does suggest that there is some kind of a schism there. What we want to know is, more of the nature of the schism, and is it something we should be concerned about at all? And whether or not we should be concerned, how to interpret the schism is really an ongoing discussion. You have people who are really pretty optimistic about the millennial generation. This past fall, two authors came, Mike and Morley, Mike Hayes and Morley Winograd, and they presented their book, Millennial Momentum, How a New Generation is Remaking America, Reshaping America. And they're just very hopeful. They write, a new, positive, accomplished, and group-oriented civic generation emerges to change the course of history and remake America. And they use a lot of words like this can-do spirit, civic idealism, and they really do believe that this generation will be able to fix a divided America with their transformative ways. And this isn't just reflected in their literature. We can see this kind of in the world around us. It's reflected in the 2008 election turnout. More young people were there than senior citizens. In Occupy Wall Street, we see that around now. There's a lot of talk about that and a lot of young people's involvement in that movement. But there are a lot of people who have a more pessimistic view of young people's engagement. And very recently, Christian Smith wrote a book, Lost in Transition, and he talks about the millennial generation. And he writes, almost all emerging adults today are either apathetic, uninformed, distrustful, disempowered, or at most only marginally interested when it comes to politics and public life. Both the fact itself and the reasons for it speak poorly for the condition of our larger culture and society. He blames things like hyper-individualism and this, I guess, just consumer capitalism, things like that, for moral relativism, for why youth are engaged. And it's not just disengaged, and it's not just bad for young people. He really believes this is something we should be cautious about as we move forward as a nation. And this is also perhaps mirrored in contemporary events. We did see the youth turnout declined in the 2010 elections, and it was even less than the 2006 midterm elections, so it's going down, it seems. And because this discussion is so dynamic, and because there's a lot of uncertainty, we really do believe that we need a different approach to understanding this. And we feel that it really it justifies a quantitative approach, a quantitative methodology. And what we looked at in particular is the role of attitudes and how attitudes play a role in engagement. We know that there are a lot of other factors that affect engagement besides just attitudes. There's socioeconomic factors, there's information, education level, how much of a role your parents are involved in getting you, I guess, aware and engaged. But we are arguing that there's still a lot to be said for attitudes, particularly that they matter. Attitudes matter, and we know that behavior is influenced by political capital, or a sense of connection to the political process or a sense that the political process is responsive to you. We also know that millennials' political attitudes do differ than those of previous generations, so that also probably going to have an effect on, what they do. And finally, we believe that by better understanding attitudes, we might better understand the connection to civic and political behavior. So this last year, I guess, the RU voting had a solely qualitative methodology, and this is what we did again. We did add a new component as well, where we had a quantitative component, so we did quantitative analysis. And qualitative analysis methodology is great because it seeks to understand the behavior from the subject's point of view. It's inductive rather than deductive, and it allows for description, exploration, and it's beneficial when the subject area is uncertain, as we feel this one is. So specifically what we did is that we recruited subjects from Rutgers, New Brunswick, and there was random outreach at high traffic areas like Brower. We did public outreach via the Daily Targum and listservs, and we also sent out email invitations to a random selection of undergraduates. We held 5 focus groups last semester, and our total number of participants were 30. After that, all our data was transcribed and we coded it. It took a while, but we made our own typology, and Zain's going to talk about that very shortly. He'll talk a bit about our findings, but I do want to talk about what I'm going to be talking about when I come back here, and that's the quantitative component, because that was different. And we went to CIRCLE, which stands for the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. It's based at Tufts University, and they also use our typology of defining engagement. And we wanted to do this because it allows us to explore the connection more between attitudes and different types of behaviors, because we're not able to do that with just our qualitative approach. But I'm going to let Zain talk about what we found. Focus group.
So the first question I should answer is, why do we want to study these attitudes? And there's been a lot of research dating back to the 1960s, 1970s, talking about the connection between attitudes and behaviors. So, if you believe, say, that you have a duty to be a good person or to vote as a citizen, you're more likely to do so. Which is why it's important for us to understand these sorts of attitudes. And this generation, every generation has its own set of attitudes. Post-war generations, as I think Shadi alluded to, have increasingly had less of a belief or less of an attitude towards this sort of civic engagement, especially voting and other sorts of political engagements. So we just wanted to further expand on that knowledge. We conducted focus groups, 5 focus groups, ranging from 45 minutes to an hour and a half each time, which meant that we covered a lot of topics. For the purposes of this presentation, we're going to hit on 4 major topics. First is this idea of civic duty. That is, what do you owe your fellow citizens as being a member of a community? And that's going to transition into discussing Occupy Wall Street. And then we're going to switch gears a little bit, move to efficacy, which I'll define later, but basically is your belief on how you can affect the political process. We'll do internal efficacy and external efficacy. Moving first to civic duty. We found that there were 3 broad types of attitudes that were reflected this year. We asked this question, or I guess the RU voting program asked this question last year too. The responses were broadly similar, but there were a few differences, which I'll get to in a little bit. So the largest answer this year, which was the same as the largest answer last year, was that we have no duties. That you have to pay your taxes, you have to obey the laws of the land, and that's it. You can see in the quotes that we have kind of broadly representative samples. I don't think you have any duties. I feel like you decide whether you want to be engaged or not. And that's kind of the attitude I think that we don't want to foster. That's the sort of thing we want to inhibit it, because the more people who feel that way, the less likely we are to have a robust democracy, a robust community. And that really takes away from what America is. So hopefully we want to move them away from no duties and at least get them to be a good person, which is, again, a group that was well represented this year and a group that was well represented last year. Which is not that we need to go out and actively vote or campaign or take part in elected office, but that we should at least, help our elderly neighbor rake the leaves off their yard or pick up trash off the street, things like that. So, being a good person, helping out your neighbors and all that stuff. This is better because it shows at least some level of engagement. And the last section is hopefully what we're more going for, which is voting or being expressive, using your efficacy to make a difference. The interesting thing about this section this year compared to last year is that last year we had a lot of people who said that voting was the best way to use your there was a major answer was voting, and this year we got a lot more people who said that you should participate in the political process, like in terms of saying things or being expressive. That it's a difference, and it's interesting because last year, 2010 obviously was the midterm elections, which were highly contentious, and that's when they said that we should be voting. And this year, 2011, at the same time we were doing these focus groups, was Occupy Wall Street. So it kind of reflects a changing of the times in terms of the events that are going on. So you can see in the comments that there is a lot of people who indicate that you should be going to your town hall meetings, you should be speaking to your congressman. That is a duty that you have. There's an interesting parallel between this and some of the quantitative data Shadi's going to talk about later. So we'll probably end up coming back to this slide in our conclusion, but that's that. And like I said, Occupy Wall Street. This was a major issue when we were doing our focus groups, and we used it to measure what people thought of expressive engagement. So, our protests is a good thing. How should people be protesting? And we got a lot of responses, which were generally positive, but there were a healthy amount of people who felt that it was a waste of time, people who weren't sure, and people who just didn't know about it. So each of these quotes actually represents a different type of common answer. For positive, the first is, it's positive because they're taking action. That not necessarily anything about the message of the protest, but just being expressive is positive. The second is, it's positive because I don't like big business and I support their message. And the third reason it was positive is because it's positive because I'm a student and they're fighting for students' rights. Negativity represented this to a degree. There were some people who said, I think it's bad because they're wasting their time. They shouldn't be wasting police resources, land resources, that sort of thing. And that's the first quote, they're wasting resources, valuable police. And the second one is, I think, frankly, they're dumb. They don't know what's going on. And that was something that we heard every so often. The mixed category combined the positive and negative elements in all sorts of different ways, and you can see that reflected in the quotes. And there were a few people, not many, but there were a few people who just said, I don't know anything about the Occupy Wall Street movement, I'm not interested, things to that effect. So this is an interesting way to see how the millennial generation sees expressive engagement, so protests and that sort of thing. Finally, I'm going to deal with efficacy. Efficacy is how you feel you are able to engage with a process, specifically in our case, a political process. Internal and external efficacy are two different types. Internal efficacy is internally, how much difference do I feel that I can make in a process? So can I write my congressman and get him to propose a law? Can I go start a community outreach program and get people to vote for a specific candidate? External efficacy is kind of the mirror image, which is how open do I think the political process will be to me? So if I go to someone, will they accept me? We found an overwhelming amount of negative responses for both of these categories because it seems as though the millennial generation, for one reason or another, feels that A, they aren't going to be able to make a difference, and B, even if they tried to make a difference, doors would be closed to them. And in bolded, the red words kind of capture the broad messages that we heard. So internal, I am definitely unprepared. That was kind of the theme. And it was either because they're uninterested in engaging with the process because it doesn't matter unless it's really affecting them on a personal level, or it's that they're unable, that even if they wanted to go out, even if they wanted to get registered to vote or to run for office, they wouldn't know where to turn, which is indicative of low internal efficacy. External efficacy means that would the process be willing to listen to them? And overwhelmingly, again, it was no. It was either things like, they will listen to lots of people, they'll listen to a majority, but they won't listen to me. And they'll listen to people with money, they'll listen to people with influence, but they won't listen to me. Or they'll listen to older voters, which was actually very common, surprisingly common. They'll listen to people who own homes, they'll listen to people who collect paychecks, they won't listen to me. So,
this is true.
You're kind of, I guess this kind of gives us an interesting picture into the attitudes of young people qualitatively, and it is bolstered and kind of modified in a way by the quantitative data Shadi's got presented.
So now I'm going to talk about what the national data sets can tell us about the relationship between attitudes and behavior. So what we just did in the focus groups, what Zain just described to you, that was all the qualitative work we did, which is great because it gives you a really rich understanding of, I guess, about the attitudes, rich description of attitudes, I should say. But it doesn't really tell us anything about the connection between your attitudes and your behavior. So if we know, people have a high sense of civic duty, we don't know if they're going to vote, if they're going to volunteer, what are they going to do with that? We can't measure it. So that's why we use the 2006 National Civic and Political Health of the Nation survey by Circle to kind of help us better understand that relationship. So this survey had a total number of 2,232 participants, and that was all people, not just 15 to 25-year-olds, but everybody who was involved. We selected just for young people, 15 to 25, and we used this data set because it is the most recent national data set on youth civic and political behavior that uses our same typology. So here's what we did. We wanted to we took 3 attitudinal measures, and they were things that covered civic duty, internal efficacy, and external efficacy. So those were our 3 attitudes. Then there were 24 questions that measured engagement, and you could see the 3 types at the side, and civic, political, and expressive. And then using SPSS, we cross-tabulated attitudinal variables with behavior variable to determine their relationship. So there were 9 questions about civic engagement. So there were questions like, have you ever volunteered for a religious organization? Or have you ever worked with others to solve a problem? And the average of those types of questions of all young people, 39% of young people did those kinds of behaviors. For political, we had 7 questions about political activities. There were things like, do you talk to people and try to convince them to vote for a particular candidate? Are you registered to vote? Of all young people, 28% of them did political activities. And then finally, there's the expressive activities. There's 8 questions about that, and they include, have you ever contacted an official to express your opinion? Have you ever taken part in a protest? Only 18% of young people did expressive activities on average. Oh, 16. Okay. So our first attitude is civic duty, and the question that was asked to gauge civic duty from the survey is, which statement do you agree with more? It is my responsibility to get involved to make things better for society, or it is my choice to get involved to make things better for society. The majority of young people said the second one, it is my choice, 57%, and 39% we would say have a higher sense of civic duty. So we say 39% have a high sense of civic duty, 57 on the lower side. So when we cross-tabulated behaviors and attitudes, the general impression was that more often than not, there were no strong contrasts between behaviors and attitudes. That's to say, it didn't really matter if you had a high sense of civic duty or not. It didn't affect what you did. So for an example, the question, have you volunteered for an organization involved with youth, children, and education? It didn't matter if you had a high civic duty or low civic duty, they all said yes. Same thing for contributing to a campaign. It didn't matter how you felt about your sense of civic duty, nobody did it. There were 2 exceptions, and that was volunteering for a religious group and spending time participating in any kind of community service. And this we did see a difference of attitude affecting your behavior. If you did have high civic duty, you were more likely to do these things than those who didn't. So to quantify the relationships, we took the average of all the questions about civic engagement. So of all those people who have a high sense of civic duty, 48% of them did some kind of civic engagement. For those with a low sense of civic duty, 34% did some sort of civic engagement. For political engagement, of all the people who have a high sense of civic duty, 32% did some kind of political activity. For those with low sense of civic duty, 27% did political activities. And then finally, for expressive engagement, 20% of those who found that it was who had civic responsibility did some sort of expressive engagement, and then for low sense, only 15% did expressive engagement. And what we do see here is that even though like they all answer kind of the same thing, we do see that having a sense of civic duty does seem to affect, at least how much you do it. You see that in the numbers. So the next attitude is external efficacy, and that's, would you say that the political system in this country is or is not responsive to the genuine needs of the public? Those who have a high sense of external efficacy said yes, it is responsive, and that was only 26% of young people. 39% said that they didn't feel the political system in this country is responsive. And then 31% said they just haven't thought much about it. So again, just like with the civic duty one before, we found that your attitudes didn't really affect your behaviors. For example, for volunteering for an environmental organization, it didn't matter what your external efficacy was. If it was high or if it was low, most people just didn't do it. Same thing with being registered to vote. It didn't matter if you thought government was responsive, most people did vote. There were two exceptions again for volunteering for a religious group. Those with high external efficacy were involved in religious groups, and unlike those with low ones. And same thing with done anything to help raise money for a cause. You were more likely to do that if you had a high sense of external efficacy. We did find something a little bit different when we quantified this relationship, and you can really see it in the numbers. If you did have a high sense of civic of external efficacy, you can see 34% did some kind of civic activity, and 31% who said it wasn't, who had low external efficacy, did a civic activity. So that number, it's not that different, and it gets less and less as we go down. So 34% of those with high external efficacy engaged in political activities, 32% engaged in political activities with low external efficacy, and 20% of those with high external efficacy did some sort of expressive engagement, and 19% did expressive, they had low external efficacy. So the numbers really aren't that different. Okay, and then finally we had internal efficacy, and the question asked about that was, how much difference do you think you personally can make in working to solve the problems that you see? 10% had a very high sense of internal efficacy. They said it would make a great deal of difference. 45% said some difference, 31% said little difference, and 13% said no difference at all. Unlike civic duty and external efficacy, we didn't really find a pattern. Those with high and low internal efficacy didn't always behave in the same way. So this suggests that attitudes do kind of affect your behavior here. So for example, when asked, have you participated in community service? Those who said that who had a higher sense of, who answered 1 or 2 for this question, they did do it. But if you had little or no efficacy, then you did not. The majority did not. For talking to people to convince them to vote for a particular candidate, nobody did that unless you had that really high sense of internal efficacy, then you were more likely to have done that. And finally, for boycotting, for expressive engagement, most categories said no, except for those, again, with the highest sense of efficacy. They did expressively engage in politics. So to quantify these relationships, it's much like the civic duty one, and you do see that if you have a high internal efficacy for civic engagement, you're more likely to do it. For low, you're not likely to do it. So you see 50% versus 27%, and I won't read through them all, but you can see, again, the numbers, I guess, are affected by your attitude. So I am going to give it back to Zain. He's going to tell you our conclusions. So thank you.
So it's kind of, this part is broken up into 3 sections. First, how our qualitative section, the part that I did, helps us understand Shadi's section and what they can do better. Second, what Shadi's data can kind of bring to light, what kinds of new questions it can bring out. And third, the overall picture, where we're at and what we as a team, I guess, collectively think and wonder and ask for future research on. So firstly, we want to know specifically about internal political efficacy, because I'm not sure if Shadi mentioned this in her thing, but in the quantitative question that we used in the circle data set didn't deal with politics. It just dealt with, do you think you can make a difference? And that's not exactly the same, because you can think you made a difference by going to a community, like a food bank or something like that, and volunteering your time. That's not political. So we would say that you need questions relating to political efficacy to try to measure that and see whether quantitatively students and really the population at large think that they can make a difference politically. The second thing we would say is that the way Shadi's question on civic duty worked was, it said, I think it is my choice to get involved in society, or it is my responsibility. That's kind of a yes-no question, but when I did it, and when I tried qualitatively understanding civic duty, it was either I have no duties, I can be a good person, I can vote, I can protest. There's a lot more variety there. So what we would say is that when you ask that question, it should be sort of a check-all that apply. I think that this is a duty, that's not a duty, and this is a duty. And that'll help us to understand more specifically what things are duties, what things aren't duties, and which sorts of things go together. There's a lot of interesting cross-tabulation to be done there. Quantitatively, Shadi's section, I don't know if you guys all picked up on this, but when she was doing civic duty, the question was, is it a choice or responsibility? 52%, a majority of the people who thought that it was a responsibility still hadn't taken any sort of action. So, it's one of those things where your preferences don't line up with your actions. It's like me saying, I like apples. And then you take a whole collection of people who like apples and you ask them how often they eat apples. And half of them say, I don't eat apples. Well, then why do you like them in the first place? So there's a real schism here where we don't understand what's going on. And it extends through all of the questions to some degree. And that sort of inconsistency, that why do you think this if you're not going to do this? Or why do you do this and then that? Extends really broadly through the entirety of the millennial generation's expressive engagement with the political process. So, we're understood to be the indifferent generation, the one who doesn't really care. But then why are we going out on the streets and protesting like we are at Occupy Wall Street? Why are we voting in huge numbers in 2008 if we don't vote? And if we're voting in 2008, why don't we vote in 2010? These sorts of questions, they keep popping up over and over and over. And when we discussed them as a team, we came to two possible conclusions. First, either that there's some sort of underlying rationality behind all these actions that we're just not picking up on. And if so, then I think you're going to need some sort of game theory or that sort of research to understand it, because it may be outside the realm of explainable understanding. And the other one, which I think is something that relates back to the Lost in Transition book that Shadi was talking about, is that there's something specific about this generation, the hyper-connectedness, the instantaneousness of everything in this generation. That today I'll wake up and I want to be civically engaged, so I'll go, to Elijah's Promise Soup Kitchen and volunteer for a day, and then I'll be done. And then tomorrow you ask me, I'll say, no, I don't have a responsibility. That there's kind of like an on-off switch, I guess, that keeps going on and off constantly in the millennial generation, and that may be harder to understand. It's really an instant gratification sort of thing, and it's one of those things that you can't really try to capture in a systematic way, because people. If I don't understand my own preferences, I will be completely unable to explain them rationally to you. Finally, I just want to end with this. There was a quote that I came upon when I was reading through the transcriptions of the focus groups we did, and it didn't make any sense to me the first time I read it, because I didn't understand why somebody would think this. But going back after we did everything, it seems poignant, because it talks about how youth voters and youthful citizens in general are bandwagoners. How they'll jump onto something really quickly, just because one person does it, and then just as quickly they'll jump off. It says politicians see youth voters as bandwagoners. And I think maybe they do. That might explain why there's so much, there's an interest in engaging them on their own terms. And I think it might not the politicians might be onto something here. There may, that sounds a little bit weird to say, but politicians may be onto something here. Researchers should maybe look at youth voters less as citizens and individuals who are able to consistently take their ideas from day 1 to day 2 to day 3, and more as bandwagoners, to understand the shifts of the generation as a whole. Because I think once you understand it in a sort of what is going on today, and what do I take from today, once you understand it in more of a time way, I guess, as opposed to a philosophical way, the results may begin to make more sense. It's a very broad understanding, and it's something that hasn't even begun to be researched, But I think long term, this may be where this sort of millennial research needs to go, because this may be the best way to understand it.
Thank you.
So first, congratulations to Zain and Shadi for giving a really excellent presentation. But then why don't you both stand, and if anyone has some questions they want to pose to them, have at it. Stand so they can see. Does anyone have any questions? Anyone? Yes?
Is this bandwagoners more like moving towards independent voters as opposed to a Democratic registered and a Republican registered? Is bandwagoner an independent?
I think that's actually a really interesting way to think about it, because we hadn't done that. That wasn't something that came up in our conversation. But that is kind of reflective in that. That is, I'm not willing to call myself a Democrat or a Republican. I'm independent, and that I can take it whichever way that I want. So I think moving forward, as we come to understand this, that is an interesting piece of evidence, the growing number of independent voters, and that's something that we should look at.
We didn't ask that in our focus groups, and it wasn't really brought up either in the quantitative data done by Circle.
But we could cross-tabulate.
Yeah.
If there's a question in the data set that
Then we
asks them
wouldn't
to
be able to do
partisan,
that.
you could cross-tabulate it. Professor Field?
Okay. I graduated from college in the decade after the Vietnam War, and the decade after Watergate. My decade was the me generation, the one that was disengaged, the one that turned away from activism, the one that wouldn't show up for a protest, the one that wouldn't do anything. My generation includes President Obama now, just as a little aside. But when I was graduating from college, everyone was freaking out over the young generation. And I think we've been freaking out ever since. And every new gen, I mean, the millennial stuff, the generation, we've been talking about that for 20 years. And with the terms changing slightly. And every single time someone talks about it, it's like, what's getting bad? So I'm wondering if you have any information about whether this really is worse or different than it was 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, well, that's kind of why we wanted to look at attitudes. Because we weren't sure yet, is it just an age thing? Is it just a young people don't like politics thing? But we do have reason to believe that the way that my particular generation, millennial generation in particular, looks at behavior. And maybe it's not true, but we seem to think that compared to especially like baby boomer generations, and it's true, it's a generation in progress, that's what we always say. It's a generation in progress, so we don't really know. If we won't know until like 40 years from now.
One of Shadi's earlier slides referenced Zukin. He wrote a book in 2006 about this, A New Engagement it's called. It deals with this, and it tries taking polls from those time periods to compare directly generation to generation. And that's where we get this idea that increasingly it is getting worse and worse. And I think you're beginning to see those deleterious effects have their, you know what I mean? Like, you're right to a point to say that we're making a big deal about this and it doesn't seem to make a difference. But on the other hand, it kind of does, because you just keep seeing confidence in Congress go down and down and down. And I think it's beginning to reach a tipping point where we're finally beginning to see the effects. And it's one of those things where once it kicks in and once people just stop believing, it's over. So I would say first that there is some evidence to say that it's getting worse and worse. And second, that we may not be able to see the effects until it hits a certain critical mass. And at that point, yeah.
And also, Connor and I do work on young elected leaders, and we find, like, if this millennial generation is the most diverse one of all, the most educated, we don't really know if we see these young people going into politics, who our future leader is going to be. Connor and I, so far, it's looking pretty grim. So yeah, engagement is important. Yeah.
So I run two different organizations on campus, a political one and a community service-based one. The community service-based one has a lot of members that show up, but maybe at a regular weekly meeting, like this many people, and at the political one, about half. As the semester's gone on, it's kind of declined, but
Both.
Both have declined, seriously. And
busy.
Yeah, busy, I say, but maybe something along the lines of engaging, though. Even in the fall semesters, no one would sign up for anything, political or in the community service. I'd be at the hospitals in the fall semester, I'd be out campaigning on the weekends, and both organizations weren't really engaged, you know, countering some of Zukin's ideas. What can you say about that?
Okay. Yeah, actually, this is something that Zain kind of referenced that we read in the Lost in Transition book by Christian Smith.
It's so depressing, that book.
It's so depressing, but you know, brings up some good points. And one of them is about the instant gratification thing that Zain was saying. He says something about when we think about democracy, how it's always been in the past, people all come together because they need this feeling of like togetherness. And our generation, because of social media, because we have other ways of coming together without actually like physically being together and doing things for our community. So I could just go onto your Facebook and see what you're doing and feel that void is filled. Like I feel connected to you.
Feel like you did your
I
good
liked
for the
you.
day.
I know what you're listening to.
Okay.
And he says the way he describes it is that we don't have the time or the interest to do the kinds of things that you do on the weekend, and that it's much easier to go on Facebook and feel connected to you. So that's one thing. I mean, I don't know why it is, and it's an important question.
And I think going off that, there is kind of the way we can the way we consider doing a good deed is very different, like you were saying. So I think if you've changed, and I'm not giving you advice for your organization, I wouldn't recommend that.
I know you can't.
But what I would say is, the more you try to engage individuals with things like technology, like newer things that they can do quickly and on their own time, your percentages will go higher. And then once you do things that are, you know, more, you have to devote 6 hours of your life, and these 6 hours of your life to it, then your percentages will go down, because that's not, I guess, how our generation is wired, really.
Thank you.
Do you think that people might feel less engaged because they're like dissatisfied with the political process, or is it more like apathy?
It's a chicken and egg sort of thing, I think, because when your smartest people in the country are going, you know, to work as engineers or as doctors or as you know, investment bankers or whatever, and they're not going through the political process, the political process breaks down, and then it breaks down, and people are like, that doesn't do anything, and it's a vicious cycle, really. So I think there is some level of that, but really, if you think about it, times when people were more engaged, the political process was, I think, objectively worse. That is, there were times where Congress was just a bunch of people who were, you know, misogynists and binge drinkers, and people didn't mind at that point. I think there's been kind of a shift that's probably way too big to talk about right now, but I think that there's a big answer to that question, and not one that's necessarily within the scope of the research. Yeah.
I didn't hear the introductions, I'm sorry, I came in late, but what I want to know after listening to the two of you is, are you going to run for office?
First, I need to find any evidence I can that someone will be willing to vote for me.
We'll vote for you here, we'll vote for you.
Oh, we would.
Yeah, my mom and dad will.
Oh, I definitely not.
Why not?
Why not? Oh. Just not for me. That's an awful answer. We didn't like when we asked this in our focus groups. We didn't like when they did it. I just would rather be behind the scenes making a difference.
So first, I just want to say that I think your presentations and your combined presentation, I think it was terrific. And congratulations to you and for the work that you've done and your level of understanding. It's really impressive. And to you, Elizabeth Matto,
Yes.
for the guidance you provided.
Thank you. My
which is
pleasure.
just very impressive.
My pleasure. Thank you. Represented me well.
So I just want to take this from whence it comes, which is that I think if you get up and brush your teeth in the morning, it's political. So everything.
It's all politics.
So right. So it just is something that occurred to me. For years and years, we've been talking about this business of going to the food bank as opposed to doing something political. And I was once engaged in teaching a course, an experiment in which we were trying to teach the students that the reason that you needed to look into the reason there was a food bank and where did that fit into the system, and, you know, get yourself to asking some questions that engage with politics by understanding that. But when you said, it just struck me as a bit different. When you said going to a food bank is not political, I thought to myself, well, why not? I mean, it's not running for office, it's true. But it is, I'd like to see some research on the people who go to food banks. I mean, my guess is that in terms of their affiliation and even their behavior on election day, that we could find out something about political activity and that would fit in some way to what we call political. They may not be taking another step of a kind that, you know.
We actually, that's not very far from what we were doing, because we didn't necessarily look at comparing two different behaviors. So we didn't look at, voter turnout versus community involvement, but we did look at the attitudes. And that's something we could pretty quickly and easily do, which is, and it's a natural expansion, I think, to look at whether behaviors are correlated.
Yeah.
It's the reason I said that is because I think intellectually, at least for me, and I'm willing to bet for most of the people who are my generation, we consider community service good no matter how you cut it. And politics is kind of, it could be good, it could be bad. It depends on what manner it's going, what the manner of the engagement is, I guess. And I don't know, I guess there's a substantive difference, a real clear line between something like community service. It's simple, which is easy. You can see the good work you do and that's it. Versus political, which is more writing your congressman, going to meetings, talking and talking and talking, and then maybe you see a difference. Just intuitively, I guess, for us, there's a difference.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to collapse all distinctions, but it strikes me there are some interesting questions about who it is who goes to food banks and how do they vote, or how else do they behave, and how do they view themselves in the public debate, whatever the debate is that's going on in the context of elections and so forth. And the only other thing I would say about you're talking about the, best and the brightest going into whatever that string of professions you name. It doesn't help when the people who run, it's just one of my bugaboos, but when the people who run for office trash the office they're running for and say, talk against government, it doesn't help to create an atmosphere in which people are attracted to doing that, even though they're running for it themselves.
I think that's interesting because, in a sense, you do have to run against the office because, especially today, because it's hard to say, I think that the Senate is doing great, but I can do it better because nobody thinks the Senate is doing great. And again, it's I think a chicken and egg sort of thing. It's a vicious circle because if the only way you're going to get there is by talking badly about it, and then once you get in, someone else is going to talk badly about you. You see, that's an interesting idea. I mean, I guess it's not strictly related, but again, something we're going to think about, I guess, later on.
It's a very basic question, but was there a reason, other than, I guess, logistical, it was easier that you just did students here instead of reaching out to others, like New Brunswick citizens?
I assume logistics.
Yeah, I mean, and a combination. If we were looking at college, certainly you're right. The quality of the research would be enhanced if you're looking at more than one site. We did want to just focus on college students right now, but there are certainly all sorts of directions you could go in the future. You could compare college age to residence. You could include more than one college campus. That does make it sort of a different project from a practical standpoint. Did you have a point or a?
Well, no. Well, because the survey was a broader.
Correct, a national sample.
Yeah, I'm also wondering, is the type of person who attends a focus group a more active person in general?
Yeah, I think you make a really good point, which is why we try to have a multi-pronged approach when you're recruiting your subjects. And sure, certainly you are going to have some of those who would, have a self-selection bias there, which is why we also.
When we were finding recruits, they're like, I don't know anything about politics, and we're like, no, we want you, and like. We offered an incentive, $25. Are you express card? That helped. So we tried to break that down.
We tried to randomize whenever we could. In that, one of the hard parts about standing out in a high traffic area is I would tell my students, stand at your table and only approach every third person that comes by. So that third person may be the one who's looking the other way and running away from you, and the second person may be the one that's on their way, want to do it with you. So that takes a lot of self-control to not just take the second one who's willing to do it. So you try to introduce randomness as much as possible, but yeah, you bring up a really good point. It's hard to avoid that. Maybe, did you have a question?
Yeah, a quick question,
Sure.
kind of related to Ruth's first question. So, I really enjoyed this research first, and one of the things I was thinking of is, a natural extension would be where did the attitudes come from?
Mm-hmm.
So one thing I was thinking, I was struck by in the quantitative section, you mentioned that the people that I think answered the religious question, that they were more religious, was at least correlated with some of their behaviors. So I was wondering if you took demographic information, because I know that's usually really rich in Rutgers samples too, and looked and saw anything there.
That's a good question. We did not.
Not
but
yet,
I
okay,
think you
'cause I'd be
certainly could.
interested to know.
I think it's part of that data set, if you stuck with that data set, where you could actually look and isolate sort of the society or family socialization and background and what the influence of that would be.
Okay, yeah.
But I think it'd be really interesting
Yeah.
also. And as Shadi had mentioned early on, and something we talked about a lot, this is just one we know there are all sorts of factors
Right.
that influence what you do. And this is just one slice of it, the role of attitudes. But I think you bring it, and I thought that was interesting too, especially it was always the religious organizations that popped up as the exception.
Right.
Any other, we've had one more, if anyone has one more question, or? Okay, well first I want to, again, congratulate Shadi and Zain, and this is a nice way. It's a really nice way, a nice culminating event for a year's worth of really, really hard work.